Okay, welcome to the second video of this. So we're going to plot the parent function of cosine. And remember, cosine is the x-coordinate going all the way around the unit circle. So we're going to do the same thing that we did before, and I'm just put the degrees in like we have above that we did for our sine graph. So I'm going to put those in real quick. Okay, so as you can see, I put the degrees in for the cosine graph. Now what we're going to do is put in the exact values. Remember, cosine is the x-coordinate going around the unit circle. So unlike sine at 0 degrees and 0 radians, cosine actually starts at 1. Then we go to the square root of 3 over 2 at pi over 6. Then we are at square root 2 over 2. And then at 60 degrees, we're at 1/2. And then at pi over 2, we're at 0. So you can see the values are actually decreasing starting at 1. Now in the second quadrant, cosine is negative. So now we go negative 1/2. Then we go negative square root 2 over 2. Then we do negative square root 3 over 2. And then we have negative 1. Okay, now we're in the third quadrant. Cosine in the third quadrant is still negative, so we're at negative square root 3 over 2, negative square root 2 over 2, negative 1/2, and 0. Now we go to the fourth quadrant where cosine is positive. And so then we become positive 1/2, then we become positive square root 3 over 2, and then we become positive square root 2 over 2, and then we become positive square root 3 over 2, and then positive 1. So, this should be square root 2 over 2 right there. Okay, remember we do our approximate values in the column at the right just to help give you the ideas. And if you remember, square root of 3 over 2 is that 0.87, square root 2 over 2 is that 0.71 value, and we have 0.5. So if you think about this, think about how we're going to graph cosine. Cosine starts at 1 and ends back at 1. So think about what kind of graph it's going to be. Okay, so now I brought the cosine graph because I know that I remember the same pattern as what the sine is. But as our table says, the cosine graph starts at 1. Okay, so before I start graphing, I'm going to put my main radian points in that I talked about with the sine graph. So we're going to start at 0, then we're going to be at pi over 2, then we're going to be at pi, then we're going to be at 3 pi over 2, and then we're going to be at 2 pi. Okay, these are the 5 main points that you always want to have. Now remember the pattern for cosine. At 0, it was at 1. Okay? And then at that first one, 30 degrees, or pi over 6, it was right close to 1 at 0.8. Then it went down to that 0.71, then we're at 0.5, and then at pi over 2, we're actually here at 0. Okay? So it looks almost like a line, but then it continues. After at pi over 2, which is 2 pi over 3, we're at that 0.5, then we do 0.7, then 0.8, and at pi we're at negative 1. Okay? Then if we come back at 5 pi over 6, we are negative 0.8, then we're negative 0.71, then at, where are we? 5 pi, or 4 pi over 3, we're at negative 1/2, then at 3 pi over 2, we're at 0. So if you look, it looks like somewhat of a parabola so far. Then at after 3 pi over 2, we're at 5 pi over 3, which is 1/2. Then you're at 0.71, then you're at 0.8, then you end at 2 pi, back at 1. And sure enough, if you look at this graph, it looks like a nice parabola, but it's got a couple of ways the ends keep going, which means your graph goes on and on. Okay? Now, we talked about crest and trough with the sine graph. If you look here, definitely at the bottom, that is called your trough. Okay, well if you look at the top, the highest, you actually have a crest at 0 and you have a crest at 2 pi. So those are the highest points. Okay, so same thing as we talked about before on the sine. Right now, your x-axis is what we consider as the baseline. Okay, so that's still the baseline. And if you think about what the height, which again we call amplitude of this wave, actually also happens to be 1. So the amplitude, which is the height of the wave, remember amplitude is measured from the baseline to the crest or baseline to the trough, and the amplitude is 1. Okay? Another component we talked about was the period for this particular graph. When do we start and when do we stop before this graph starts repeating? Notice that this curve right here, it's going to start repeating what it started at 0. So the period is from 0 to 2 pi. So we just say the period of this is 2 pi. Remember, from 0 to 2 pi in the unit circle, you don't have your values repeating, but after 2 pi, we have the same values. Okay? Let's do the domain. The domain for this graph that continues on would be from negative infinity to infinity, and the range for this graph would be from -1 to 1. So as you can see, these graphs are very similar, but they look different because of where they start on the unit circle. Cosine always starts at 1, while sine starts at 0. Congratulations, you did your two parent graphs.